Olá, comunidade de startups do Brasil. Meu nome é Laís de Oliveira, sou fundadora da Hacking Communities, é um livro que eu estou lançando agora em novembro, e tenho o prazer enorme de estar aqui entrevistando no Fireside Chat o Brad Feld, que é fundador do Foundry Group e também uma das maiores referências em comunidades de startup do mundo, que basicamente foi quem definiu o termo Startup Communities com seu livro lançado em 2012. Nós vamos conversar aqui sobre o seu novo livro, Startup Community Way, e é um prazer enorme estar aqui porque ele foi uma das inspirações para a minha vida como construtora de comunidades. Antes disso, vou informar que a conversa vai ser em inglês e vocês podem acompanhar as legendas aí embaixo, ok? E com isso, vamos começar. Hey, Brad, how are you?
I'm good. Good to see you.
Good to see you too. Are you in Colorado right now? Back home?
I am in Boulder. Yep. Enjoying being in the middle of the United States instead of being on one end or the other.
I think that must be quite a shift in your lifestyle, right?
I like it very much.
That's interesting. Well, before anything, I guess everybody here knows who you are, but I like to start with a question that challenges that a little bit. So I'd like to ask you, who are you on the basis of the conversation we're about to have about the Startup Community Way? So tell me a little bit about your journey into becoming a community builder and the author of Startup Communities, Startup Community Way, founder of Techstars, Foundry Group, and everything that came from it.
Well, I've had a long arc as essentially an entrepreneur, even within the investing activity that I've done. Mm-hmm. So I started my first company when I was in college. I lived in Boston, Massachusetts. I built that company for 7 years and then sold it and took most of the money that I made and started making angel investments. I made about 40 of them in a 3-year period, just at the beginning of the rise of the commercial internet. In the middle of that, my wife, Amy Batchelor, told me she was moving to Boulder and I was welcome to come with her. We've been married for a couple of years, so she had a pretty strong hand to play. And the reason that we didn't stay in Boston was because Boston wasn't really home to either of us. I grew up in Dallas, Texas, and she grew up in Fairbanks, Alaska. So we were, Boston was very good to us, but it just wasn't home. That's developed an important part of my thinking around startup communities, which is this idea that you should choose the place you want to live and build your life around it, rather than go somewhere for an opportunity. And we moved to Boulder in 1995. I always believed that you could build startups anywhere. And my own experience was that was true. I was building startups in Boston. I was building startups in Colorado. But I also was involved in startups in Seattle, in San Francisco, in Los Angeles, in Dallas, where I grew up, in Kansas City, in Chicago. And so New York, my frame of reference, and it was very US centric because I didn't really invest and work outside the US, but my frame of reference was that you could build startups anywhere. When I moved to Boulder, I didn't really expect to be involved in any technology entrepreneurial activity. I knew one person and he moved away 6 months later. So Amy and I really moved to Boulder just to choose a place to live. And within 6 months, we knew that Boulder was where we were going to live for the rest of our lives. We love Colorado. And now being here 25 years, it's a wonderful, wonderful, awesome place to live. In post the internet bubble, so the internet bubble burst in 2001, 2002, 2003, there was starting to be entrepreneurial activity again in my world. And I had been involved from 1995 in a number of startups in Boulder and Denver and Colorado. So I'd been involved in a wave of startup activity, but the startup community was diffuse. And by 2003, 2004, it was starting to really again around. We started Techstars in 2006, and in 2000, and I started Foundry Group in 2007 with my partners. In 2010, an article came out at the very end of the global financial crisis. So time travel back 10 years. We're at the tail end of the global financial crisis. We're in this, incredibly, incredibly difficult economic time globally. And an article came out that said innovation and entrepreneurship is the path out of the global financial crisis. And there are some cities in the US that are showing the way. And those cities were the Bay Area or Silicon Valley, which of course is more than just a city. It's a bunch of cities. New York, Boston, and Boulder. And Boulder didn't fit in that. I mean, it was true, but it didn't fit in that storyline because Boulder's only 100,000 people. We literally fit in a couple of high rises in Manhattan. We can get the whole city packed in a couple of tall buildings.
Exactly.
And so I started thinking hard about what was happening in Boulder and what had happened in Boulder in the preceding 15 years that was causing this enormous amount of entrepreneurial activity in this 100,000 person city. And that's really what began my work on the book and the impetus around startup communities. Last comment on this, just so everybody knows, when I came out with the book in 2012, the phrase startup communities didn't exist. And, we'd call them innovation this or research that, or we want to be like Silicon Valley. And every now and then you'd hear the phrase entrepreneurial ecosystem. But I really was looking for a phrase that entrepreneurs and people involved in startups and people involved in community building could relate to, and hence startup communities. And it's been pretty awesome, over the last 8 years to see how this has really taken hold globally. And it's something I have this deep belief in that I said earlier, which is you should be able to choose where you want to live and then build your life around that. And it's especially for entrepreneurs.
There's two things you just said that would be the baseline for our conversation. The first is about you can build a startup anywhere. And the Boulder thesis that you've developed is a great inspiration to that. We'll talk about it. But also the idea that I read in your book, actually, of topophilia, of love of place, and that technology empowers us with the freedom to belong wherever we choose to. And that maybe has changed with the COVID-19 crisis, maybe not. That's something I want to ask you towards the end of our conversation. Before we go there, I agree with you that we can build startups anywhere. And we should have not the next Silicon Valley, but 30, as Sam Altman said from YC. There should be so many more cities with startup communities that are vibrant. So why is it not like that yet?
Well, it just takes a long time. If you go back to my first book, I had a thing called the Boulder thesis, and it had 4 principles. The second principle was that you have to have a long-term view. And that long-term view had to be at least 20 years. I've adjusted what I say. It's no longer that you just have to have a 20-year view from a starting point. It's that you have to have a continual long-term view. So I've lived in Boulder 25 years. I'm not on -5 of my 20-year journey. I'm on year 25 of my 40-year journey. You literally just have to have this very long view. If you think about Silicon Valley, I have a book in my library that's called 100 Years of Silicon Valley. And the book was written in 1994.
Wow.
So just to create perspective, right? These aren't startup communities, don't grow up overnight. And in fact, the durable phenomena is one that persists over a long period of time. Now, if you go back, for example, 100 plus years to the early 1900s, and again, I know the U.S. better than the rest of the world, but you think about cities in the U.S. in the early 1900s that had enormous entrepreneurial activity. They included cities like Detroit and cities like Philadelphia and cities like Pittsburgh. And today, there's emergent startup communities in all of those cities. But if you know the story of Detroit continued to re-energize itself. It didn't have this long view. After World War II, Detroit had an enormous renaissance because of its manufacturing base and the sort of World War II manufacturing and post-war manufacturing. But by the 1970s, Detroit had really started to become sclerotic. The very large car companies were squeezing out a lot of innovation. A lot of the cultural norms that had caused Detroit to be such an appealing place to live were starting to dissipate. So I think this is an important thing, is that you have to have this continual renewal of entrepreneurship and new company creation versus getting to a certain place and then resting on your success as a place. Last comment is many parts of the world are shifting their behavioral norms now around entrepreneurship, and especially given the extraordinary impact of digital entrepreneurship and digital technology and all things we're doing. And as a result, it creates much more availability of information, of knowledge, of interaction, of networks, of communication. And while there's still huge inequities across many aspects of our planet and in many parts of our society, and technology does continue to amplify inequities, in a lot of ways, technology has really helped democratize entrepreneurship. And like, even this is a good example of it. I'm able to have a conversation with you, from many, many, many miles away without having to physically go somewhere. And it's a very high fidelity conversation. When I started my first company in 1987, there was no information on anything about starting a company. If I wanted to kind of learn about business, I read things like the biography of Lee Iacocca, right? The very famous person who reinvented Chrysler. And Lee Iacocca wasn't really entrepreneurial. Like, he was a great business person, but that wasn't an entrepreneurial story. Or the story of Jack Welch and his reinvention and sort of scaling up of GE. And every now and then you'd come across a book by somebody who was entrepreneurial, like Fred Smith of FedEx. But most of those books were fixed in time. They didn't evolve, and they were mostly storytelling about the person, less than about what the person did and what they learned and what the
and how to do it.
And how to do it.
Yeah.
Think about what we have available today globally, not just in the bookstore.
And and not only the availability, but it touches a point you highlight in all of your books, which is part of the Give First, in my point of view, which is the culture of openness and collaboration, which also is what Annalee Saxenian attributes the success of Silicon Valley to in comparison to Boston. And as I said, you mentioned this study by Annalee Saxenian a lot in your books, which shows the path of Boston and Silicon Valley, and says that one had this continuity that you describe maybe, and building an ecosystem based on this culture of sharing openly, which is what you're doing through your books and doing with me now. You're sharing everything. And where does this culture come from, and how can we code it into our community, since it's such a key part of its success?
Well, there are two books that are foundational in my own thinking, many things over time, but really two. Regional Advantage by Annalee Saxenian is one of them, and The Creative Class by Richard Florida is the other. These books are foundational in this kind of thinking, and they both came out in the 1990s. I think Annalee's was in 94 and Richard's was in 1992. Mm-hmm. In Annalee's book, what was so powerful is she used these two cities, or these two regions, and she really referred to the region in Boston as Route 128. So it's kind of Route 128 against Silicon Valley. And she deconstructed what had happened over a 30 or 40 year period. Because if you look at the exit of World War II, Route 128 was much, much more vibrant entrepreneurial place than Silicon Valley, which had entrepreneurial activity around Stanford and then Palo Alto Research Park, and a number of companies that started to emerge like Intel. But the density and amount of activity in Boston on this one stretch of highway was off the charts. Mm-hmm. And what happened over the 30 years caused Boston to still be, and Route 128 to still be, a meaningful startup community, but really inhibited its growth relative to the Bay Area was profound. And a lot of it had to do with very simple constructs and very, very simple things. One of my favorites is the free movement of employees. In Massachusetts, there have always been very restrictive non-competition agreements, and it's always been harder for people to move from one company to another. Whereas in California, basically non-competition agreements are mostly unenforceable. There's a very specific nuance where they are, and that's usually around an acquisition of a company. But there's a very permissive, not just legal framework for the free movement of people, but also a culture of it where people move from company to company. And that's an accepted norm in the community. By the way, that has shifted in Massachusetts in the last decade, although there's been continued struggles against the non-compete dynamics. But that sort of cultural norm has changed. So there's a number of things like that in Annalee's book, and she does a really good job of showing how they're linked together and how those linkages in a positive way created a positive feedback loop that was very powerful in the Bay Area or in Silicon Valley, and really stalled a lot of growth in Massachusetts and Route 128. To link to your question around Give First and how do you like code this in to the startup community, I think it's through leadership by example and using something that I like to describe as cultural norms. I personally hate the phrase culture when applied to companies, and I really don't like the phrase culture fit. You know, when you hear a lot of companies talk about their hiring practices, historically they've said, you know, we're looking for people that have culture fit. They fit with our culture, and that's an important part of it. I hate that because what that means is that you're building a monoculture. You're building this insular thing as the company gets bigger. I like to use the phrase culture add. Every time you add somebody to your company, you're trying to extend your cultural norms. And I use the phrase norms to try to abstract it away. Like, I think the great thing about starting a company is you as a founders get to describe your cultural norms, but they're not static. Every time you add people to your business, it can extend and modify and evolve those norms. And if you're focused on doing that intentionally, it's very powerful. When you apply that to a startup community, magic happens. You go back to that 2012 book, I said you have to be inclusive of anyone who wants to engage in the startup community. If you put that into the cultural norms, we're going to be inclusive of anyone who wants to engage. Over time, you start to get more diversity in the startup community. You get different ideas, new ways of thinking, and you get this acceleration because of the change and evolution of whatever your fixed ideas are because of that notion of inclusivity and the evolution of those cultural norms. I think it's just that. If you say, look, one of our cultural norms is we're going to give first, that can mean a lot of different things. It doesn't mean a specific, you do this and then you do this and you do this. No, it's actually a philosophy around how you engage with other people. And for people here just to define it that don't know what give first means, it comes from a phrase in that first Startup Communities book, like 3 paragraphs buried in the middle of a chapter. And the section title was Give Before You Get. And the idea that you're willing to put energy, the idea is you're willing to put energy into a system without knowing what you're going to get back. It's not altruism. It's not charity. You expect to get something back. You just don't know when, from whom, over what time period, in what consideration, and in what magnitude.
There's trust, right? And within this, what you're saying is that they trust the system. They trust the community.
And the key word there is system. They trust that if they put energy into the system, you're going to get something back. And if you can get a lot of people putting energy into the system, all of a sudden this flywheel starts to spin and lots of good things start to happen. But they happen in ways that are unexpected. They're not predictable.
It's serendipitous, right? The famous word.
Serendipitous, non-transactional. You know, they're indeterminate. You couldn't have said in happen. And most enjoyably, a lot of times, if you've read the book, Adam Grant has a fantastic book called Give and Take. He's a Wharton professor, a very well known and very famous thinker, but a powerful book. And he talks about people who, as an orientation, give versus people who, as an orientation, take. And the people who give, in his research, as their orientation, are much more successful and they're much happier than the people who have an orientation always of trying to take. And so it's another part of that cultural norm. If you have this philosophy of engaging and being helpful, in addition to getting more out, you're also going to be a happier person.
And I have a question here to you, because I was born and raised in emerging countries in Brazil. Then I lived in Argentina for another emerging country, then Mauritius, Malaysia. And one thing I find across all these places, and I might be wrong as well, so I can be wrong, but I find that there is this scarcity kind of culture sometimes. I don't know if I should call it scarcity, but just in case I distrust, when my most reliable institutions, aka government, fail me, I tend to believe that I can't trust anyone, and then we create a culture of just in case I do not trust, just in case I'll try to take first. I'm not saying that Brazil as a whole is like that. There are bubbles of trust, but in general, how would you suggest, if you take a city like Sao Paulo or Rio even, or any city in Brazil, and there is a predominant culture of distrust, how would you advise within a community that we reverse engineer it and change that culture? If you have any experiences on that, that would be amazing.
A lot of experience with it, because I don't think that that's limited at all to emerging markets. I mean, think about the U.S. In 2020 and our government and the dynamics of what's going on in our country.
Oh my, yeah.
Right? And
you got a point. You got a point.
We have in the U.S., not just a healthcare crisis because of COVID and how poorly we've handled it, but an economic crisis that's generating massive inequity and huge unemployment, but at the same time, massive wealth among a small subset of companies, predominantly in technology. We have a mental health crisis because of just the enormous stressors that people are going through. And we have a racial equity crisis that has been amplified. It's a crisis that's existed in the US since inception, and it's been amplified today. And if you wandered around and said to people, do you trust your government? It's a complicated question, because do you trust your federal government? Do you trust your state government? Do you trust your city government? Do you trust the system of government as a whole? And so I would just say, I don't think it's a limited problem to emerging markets. And so my approach to it individually has been not to try to fix the problem of trust from the top down, and not to view the city or the state or the country as a thing to fix. Instead, I focused it bottom up from the startup community. I've said, I don't have to ask anybody for permission to behave this way. I don't have to ask anybody for permission to have this as my value system. And so I simply started behaving this way. And at Techstars, it's part of the culture of how Techstars functions and operates. And so you start to do that in the context of organizations. At Foundry Group, in terms of how we interact and engage with people, whether it's in Boulder or it's around the world, we try to carry that forward. Doesn't mean we're perfect, doesn't mean we don't make mistakes, doesn't mean we don't get it right all the time, but we carry that forward as a philosophy. And I think that in a geography, pick a geography like Rio or Sao Paulo, it's not that you have to get everybody on day one acting like that. You just have to get a critical mass of entrepreneurs who say, you know what, we want to have a long-term journey here. We're game to work on this for the next 20 years of our life in this city that we love. And we want to look back 20 years from now and feel like, wow, we really had an impact on how entrepreneurs and how startups and how people around entrepreneurship and startups engage with each other. And we want to have that build in a very powerful, positive way. And oh, by the way, if that philosophy spills over into other parts of the city, whether it's government or larger businesses or the university, that's positive.
Yeah, I find it outstanding that we already have a success case of this give first culture, of this, let's call it abundance mindset, and that people can look at it and see that it's a concrete thing that if they implement, if they are the first one being the role model, that could create that virtual cycle you described. And that has economic impact, positive economic impact in the long term.
Enormous. And I want to add one comment about scarcity mindset versus abundancy mindset, especially against the backdrop of inequity. And it's important to recognize that if you have abundance, and you have resources, and you care about the place you live in, and you're interested in growing and developing the startup community and evolving the entrepreneurial ecosystem over a period of time, if you're in a position where you have an abundancy mind, you have abundance, adopting an abundancy mindset is critical. At the same time, it's important to realize that a lot of people don't have abundance. And a lot of people don't have resources because of the giant inequities that we have in our society. And that lack of abundance or lack of resources doesn't mean that they should be precluded from being able to be entrepreneurs. Mm-hmm. And so one of the opportunities for people who have abundance is to engage very broadly across that whole spectrum and to use some of the resources they have, which is not just money, right? It's money, it's network, it's connections, it's experience, it's knowledge, it's other resources. to help the people on that spectrum who are entrepreneurial, but who don't necessarily have those resources out on the early part of their journey, with the hope that they can start to develop some abundance and then shift their mindset as well. Yeah. We have that phenomena writ large in the US, and we're starting to see many organizations focus on that. And just in Boulder, Boulder is a very wealthy city. It's very successful entrepreneurially. I live in the town next to Boulder, right on the border of Boulder and a town called Longmont. Longmont is a reasonably healthy city. It's in U.S. language, it's solidly middle class, whereas Boulder is very upper class kind of city, very exclusive city. And they're adjacent cities. There's a program that we started in Longmont that came from a series of entrepreneurs in Boston called Entrepreneurship for All, E for All. And the idea was to bring the Boulder entrepreneurs and the Boulder mentors and people from Boulder who had resources and have them go to Longmont to spend time with entrepreneurs who were starting their business but didn't necessarily have resources. They were working 2 jobs, they were a single mom, they had, their first business, but they weren't really a tech entrepreneur. And they weren't necessarily, Boulder is a very a non-diverse town from a perspective of race. It's a very white town. Longmont is a much more typical town in terms of the demographics of the Western U.S., sort of 25% Hispanic, Latino, and 70% white, maybe a couple of percentage points Asian and Black. So still predominantly white, but more diverse. And socioeconomically, much more of a spectrum. Well, if I tell a single mother of 2 who's in her mid-30s, who's working 2 jobs, trying to start her third company, or her company, which is her third job, hey, you know what? Just drive 30 minutes at the end of the day to Boulder and come to some of our events. Number 1, she doesn't have the 30 minutes to drive each way back and forth.
No way.
She doesn't have it. Number 2, she shows up, she doesn't look like anybody else, so she doesn't feel comfortable, even if everybody's trying to be inclusive. And she may not even need the kind of stuff that's happening in that event. Whereas when the mentors come to her and start to understand what she's working on and understand her environment and understand her context, they all of a sudden say, wow, I want to be helpful to you. I understand that dynamic. And so it's this notion that when you do have resources, it actually is a very powerful part of the Give First flywheel to proactively go engage versus everybody, if you want to be part of this, you have to have an abundance mindset. That doesn't work because a lot of people don't have.
Yeah, there's so many good things. This is such a concrete example of how to be radically inclusive, because you've mentioned that before in our conversation about inclusiveness. And I remember one conversation I had with Derek Anderson from Startup Grind, the CEO, about diversity. He said, you have to on purpose, break your bubbles, which is basically what he said. You can't, if you are someone in a privileged position, you can't wait for diversity to come and say, hey, but I'm open. I'm allowing everyone in here. You need to open the doors and go reach out because you are in a position of privilege. So it's a responsibility. And within that note, I have more questions to ask about how to embed and code in that positive contagion of Give First. But let's talk about diversity a bit. You've already started. What is the big challenge we still have in the tech industry as a whole, talking about diversity? Why does it feel like it's so hard to have more women, more diversity in terms of ethnicity or social class? And what can we do to address it?
Well, there's a lot of there's a lot of different pieces. One of the things that I learned in the U.S. I've applied it both to my experience with gender equity and now more recently with regard to racial equity, let me use gender equity as an example. It's the behavior that is additive to the system. So I started thinking about gender equity in tech 15 years ago in 2005 through meeting a woman named Lucy Sanders. Lucy had been a CTO of Avaya Labs. She had about 600 people working for her when she retired. So long arc from software engineer up to CTO of a very large research organization, technology. And when she retired, she said, I'm going to dedicate the rest of my career to getting more girls and women involved in computer science. And she was introduced to me by a common friend, and I had a random meeting with her, which I regularly do. And she described to me her vision, and she says, I'm doing this not for gender parity. Gender parity is the outcome. I'm doing this because if we want to be innovative in the US, if we want to create great products, we got to get a lot more girls and women involved in computer science, because we need better, we need better teams that have girls and women involved, and we just need a lot more people in computer science. I said to her, you had me at the word innovation. Like, gender parity as an outcome is an awesome outcome, but the driver was clear. So for the first, I agreed to be the founding chair of that organization. I started working with Lucy, and within less than 6 months, 3-4 months, I realized that pretty much everything I knew about gender equity was at best neutral and was probably hurtful or harmful. And I'll give 2 examples. And I saw this over and over again when men, and in that time frame, it was mostly white men, showed up to the gender parity discussion, or to the gender equity discussion. They would show up with sort of 2 frames of references. One frame of reference is, I'm here to fix the problem, which almost by definition means that they're implying that women are the problem, which is not true. It's kind of the opposite of that. Men are the problem, not women in this context. Or that also implies that somehow women are broken, or women need men's help to fix a problem.
It's almost a colonizing mindset, if you think of it.
Absolutely. It's a great phrase, colonizing mindset. It's a one up, one down mindset.
Yeah.
Right? It's just wrong. The other is that men would show up with anecdotes, or with, here's what we should do. And here's what we should do didn't come from their lived experience at all. And so they had no idea what the women were experiencing in the context of men. And when they showed up and said, here's what we should do, they were just recreating the same problem over and over again. So within 6 months, I said, you know what? I don't know anything about what to do here in the context of gender equity. And I changed my behavior. And that behavior, has it become codified, the phrase that we use now at NCWIT is male advocate or male ally. And this notion of being a male advocate or male ally, I prefer advocate, but ally has become more popular, is this idea that I am here supporting and helping women in whatever way they need help in the context of this. Not only am I extending my network to them, but they're extending their network to me. I'm an advocate. I'm engaging with them in support of them, rather than trying to say, here's what to do, or let me help you in creating this one up, one down. It's even more pervasive, I think, in racial equity, because of, and you could say ethnicity, and, pick your country, the different sort of racial dynamics and ethnicity dynamics in that country. Because you have these very, very deep-seated biases between people that then create behaviors where the lived experience is even more undermined, and the person who is on the inequity side of the equation is constantly trying to adapt to whatever the norms are so that they can be included, versus the person or the group with privilege trying to turn it around. And I'll give a great example. In the US, with language around venture capital and startups and business, the language that is used in the US, and venture capital language, is very white-centric language. And a number of my Black friends, when I talk to them about it, they say, wow, Brad, your book Venture Deals was super helpful in terms of just even learning the language that white VC investors use. And one of them and I were talking, and I said, what's the biggest thing that comes up over and over again with Black founders that you as a Black VC are spending time with? And he says, well, they have just, many of the Black founders I work with just have a totally different language, different words for the business, different words for what they're doing, different phrases for what their customers are, different phrases around business. And a lot of language just that are cultural differences. For example, until 12 months ago, my guess is the vast majority of American VCs had never heard the phrase unbanked. And the phrase unbanked is a pervasive phenomena within the Black American community. And today, my guess is more people have heard that phrase because there's a number of startups that are addressing people who are unbanked. But it's that kind of stuff. And so my comment to my friend was, would it be interesting for us to do a version of Venture Deals that changes the language and puts the language in language that's understandable, and sort of a bridge that's not aimed at the Black entrepreneurs, but it's aimed at the white VCs, saying, here's how to think about how this culture is thinking of, this ethnicity is thinking about these kinds of terms. I just use these as a couple of examples. Like,
it's great.
It's the same thing we talked about before. It's the person with privilege making a real effort to go to the person that doesn't have the privilege or isn't part of the community. And it's not enough to say, I'm open. Come do whatever. I'm open. That doesn't
actively go and learn to speak their language and create that space where people start talking, and then it's like an exchange really within our cities, within our communities, right?
That's right. And it has to be both directions, right? Like, it's not, here's access to my network. Well, that's fine. But you know what? I'll give you access to my network, but I want access to your network too. I want to learn. I want to have my own lived experience change versus just, okay, good, now you can be attached to my network.
It's a two-way exchange. Otherwise, we're still thinking up and down. If we're just thinking, oh, I need to give only, there's also disparity in it, right? Because then I'm not looking to learn. And I love what you've mentioned of the concrete value of diversity. Even in your book, you mentioned how Steve Jobs created the Pixar office in a way that people would bump into each other, and those creative minds would bump into each other constantly enough to come up with new ideas. And I have to wrap up because I only have 40 minutes with you. And I'm going to give you this last question, bringing up the economic value of diversity and the importance of these collisions and interactions between these diverse, colorful-minded people. How do we do that now that we no longer have geography like we did before? If before we would have those startup neighborhoods and physically be at a specific place, and serendipity would happen around the water cooler or around the coffee or around certain startup office. Now with the COVID crisis, how do you see the future of serendipity, and how can we connect with communities across the world?
Well, I think there's a really interesting phenomena going on in both of my books. A lot of the startup community ideas around place, and you highlighted the word topophilia, which means love of place.
Yeah.
And even with the COVID crisis, I don't think that goes away. I think people still have deep love of place and deep affinity for wherever they live. And that's a powerful part of it. What's happened is that we've learned in very, very rapid order, and we've adapted to having to have a virtual dynamic. That virtual dynamic, whether it's a company or a startup community or across companies or conferences or whatever, I like to view it as a positive attribute of extending networks and making it easier for people to engage across geography. And instead of viewing it as a disadvantage, view it as a way to dramatically lower the friction and cost of interacting with people across time and space. There's no question that as human beings, we will interact with each other in person plenty. I think what we now have is a much better muscle, a much better toolbox, a much better ability to engage and work with people remotely than we did in January of 2020. And it's well understood that in a place, you don't want the place to be isolated. You want your place to be connected to lots of other startup communities. And you actually want movement in and out of your startup communities, whether that movement is physical movement or virtual movement. So I would categorize all those things as critically important.
Amazing. And you've mentioned that as a critical aspect of the complexity theory, which is the basis of your new book, The Startup Community Way, that interconnectedness between communities across the world is super important as a success factor. I don't have more time with you, but this was such an amazing conversation. Thank you, Brad, for all the insights, and hope to see you in Brazil soon.
Thank you very much. And, this was great. Thanks.
Amazing. Have a good night. Bye-bye.